679. 679. 'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus. 'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word, just to rest upon his promise, just to know thus saith the Lord. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I prove him all my love. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. Oh, how sweet to trust in Jesus, just to trust his cleansing blood, just in simple faith to plunge me 'neath the healing cleansing flood. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I prove him o'er and o'er. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. Yes, 'tis sweet to trust in Jesus, just from sin and self-deceit, just from Jesus taking life and rest and joy and peace. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I prove him o'er and o'er. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. I'm so glad I learned to trust thee, precious Jesus, Savior, friend, and I know that thou art with me, will be with me to the end. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I prove him o'er and o'er. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. Number 508, following along in the book. 508, a wonderful Savior. A wonderful Savior is Jesus, my Lord, a wonderful Savior to me. He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock, where rivers of pleasure I see. He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock, that shadows a dry, thirsty land. He hideth my life in the depths of his love, and Stand, please, for our prayer and remain standing for the song that will follow.
Let's bow. Almighty God and Father in heaven, so thankful, Father, for this another beautiful day and for this privilege that we have to come together to sing these songs and to hear another word from another lesson from thy word. So thankful, Heavenly Father, that you loved us so much, that you sent your only begotten Son to this earth to die on the cross, that we may have forgiveness of our sins. We are so thankful, Father, for the preachers that we have, Dan and Jerry. And pray, Father, how they preach your word, and pray that they may continue to do this for years to come. Father, be with us in time of temptations, and pray that we will always look to you for guidance. We pray for the sick, especially those that were mentioned this morning, the ones in the nursing home, hospitals, home, sick at home. And pray, Father, that you'll be with the families in Marshall County where the shooting was this week, and pray that you will comfort them too. We pray for our country and those who are fighting to keep it safe. Pray that you will forgive our sins as we repent and turn back to them, return from them. When life is over, pray that you will give us a home in heaven. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Number 853, When We All Get to Heaven. Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansion bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sign. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of him in glory will the toils of life repay. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. You may be seated. Song of encouragement this evening. There's a fountain free, 909.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Brother Rob, for those good songs. I too look forward to when we all get to heaven. Look forward to that time. This evening we're going to tackle a parable from Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 15. And it's a difficult parable. It's one that preachers often shy away from. You'll recall that a year or so ago we talked about a parable, another one that is difficult, that people don't deal with in lessons a lot, the parable of the thick-skinned Gentile woman. We talked about that. And when we talked about that, we told you that we do not shy away from any Bible teaching. We try to teach whatever Jesus taught and to glean lessons from it for us. This evening, the lesson is about the man who was caught with his hand in the till. And it's in Luke chapter 16 and verse 1, and it's in the middle of some parables where Jesus was teaching. He was teaching the disciples, but in the hearing of the Pharisees, who were always criticizing the people around whom he spent time. You remember at the beginning of chapter 15, the tax collectors and sinners drew near to him, and the Pharisees and scribes complained, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." And that's when Jesus told the three-part parable of the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost boy. And he was basically telling them, these are the very people around whom I'm supposed to be spending time. Well, this parable is also in this series. And although verse 1 of chapter 16 says that he's talking to the disciples, if you skip over to verse 14, it says the Pharisees heard him too. The Pharisees heard this parable also. And so we want to try to glean some truths from this parable and to do the best we can with explaining this difficult thing. Let us read together, beginning in Luke chapter 16 and verse 1. There was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward." And the steward said within himself, "What shall I do? My master's taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have resolved what to do. Then, when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses." So he called every one of his master's debtors to him, and said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, "Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Cut it in half, in other words. Then he said to another, "How much do you owe?" And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light." And Jesus continues, and he says, "I say to you," to those to whom he was speaking, "make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. He who is unjust in what is least is unjust in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in what is another man's, who will give you what is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he'll hate the one and love the other, or else he'll be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." And then the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard these things and derided him. And he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your heart. For what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God." Now this is a troubling parable. This is a difficult parable. What we see here is, first of all, the man does wrong. He steals from his master. He's guilty of embezzling. He is a steward, and a steward is one who has been entrusted with the riches of another to use them wisely and well until the owner comes back for them, but he hasn't used them wisely and well. You remember in the case of Joseph, when he was sold into the household of Potiphar, that he became a steward there and was so trusted that he was over everything that the master had. He was the foreman over the whole thing. The master didn't even realize what all he had, and this could be the case here. It seems to be that this man had earned a certain level of trust. from his master. And he was in charge of all these things, but he became greedy and was not using the goods the way they ought to. He cheats his master. There's no doubt about that. An accusation was brought against him, and he didn't deny it. He just started trying to figure out, how am I going to live when I lose my job? What am I going to do? But Jesus seems to commend the man's shrewdness, and that's the difficulty here. You know that Jesus would not commend lying. He would not commend embezzling from his employer. He would not commend cheating. We know enough about Jesus and his character to know that, don't we? We know that that's not what this is, and so a surface reading of this parable causes us to think things contrary to what we know Jesus to be, and so there must be something else. There must be something else being taught here, and that's what we want to talk about. And so in this parable, you have this steward placed in charge of an estate. Oftentimes, we will read in the Bible that where the amount of authority varies. You remember in the parable, the talents, one was given 1, 2, and 1 5. Authority was usually given based upon one's ability, and you still do that. You bosses, those of you who own businesses, you know to whom to entrust a certain amount of authority and a certain amount of weight in the job, and others that you have to maybe not give as much responsibility, and so on. And so this man was given a great responsibility. Unlike Joseph, though, he used this position of trust and authority to overcharge clients, apparently, and embezzle from his master. And eventually rumors reached the master's ears, and he discovered that this entrusted slave was not doing what he ought to do. And then he was caught embezzling from the master. Now, obviously, Jesus did not approve of that. He had his hand in the cookie jar, so to speak, and he certainly wasn't saying, go do that in your job, because you and I know that that is contrary to the character of Jesus. But it's interesting that after he was caught, he started thinking, what am I going to do? Now, the very first thing he thought of was whom? Or the very first person thought of himself. That's probably what got him in trouble to start with. He was a selfish person. And he was so selfish that he didn't think the master would miss these things. Always interesting to me when someone, you see it on the news and different things, when someone dips into the till, it's always interesting that they always get caught. It may take them years. There have been times when it was 20 years down the road, but they always get caught, and you'd figure some of us would learn eventually that that's not the thing to do, because you eventually get caught. And so he starts thinking about his options. And he says, he thought about digging ditches, but he's not young anymore. He said, I'm too old to dig, and I'm not strong. And that was probably, knowing this fellow's character, just what little bit we see about his character, digging ditches was probably not his thing anyway. He was probably lazy. Would probably be the reason he tried to steal his way to success to start with. And so he was probably pretty lazy, but he said, I can't dig. I'm too... and then he thought about begging, and it's interesting to me that he thinks about what would the neighbors think. He wasn't too ashamed to steal from his employer, but he's worried about what the neighbors think when he stands out with a sign and says, I lost my job and I need help. He was too proud to beg, too old to dig, but not too ashamed to steal from his master. What could he do? And so the solution came to him in a flash, and he decided that the only way out was to steal again. And that's what he did. It was simple enough, and his idea was, I'll make such good friends of my master's debtors that when I'm out on the street, they'll take me in. I'll remind them. I'll say, you remember? You owed all this great debt, and I cut it in half with the slash of a pen, saved you all that money. And so, you know, I need a place to stay. I need a job. I need a meal. My family and I need a roof over our heads. And so he's thinking about that. He says, I'll do them a favor, and then they'll do me a favor. There are several interesting things that happens here, but he called his master's debtors one by one and reduced their debts, one by half and one by 20%. And certainly that was a thing that he was hoping that they would take him in. But another interesting thing here, I don't see any of these debtors saying, you know what, this is dishonest and I don't want anything to do with it. So that kind of questions their honesty, doesn't it? Kind of questions their character. Because none of these says, where'd you get the authority to cut my bill in half? I don't know about that. I believe I'll go to the boss and see if you have authority. No, they didn't. They say, okay, thank you. Cut it in half. Yeah, that's good. That's what I want. And so he's hoping they'll take him in and help him when he needs this. Well, the biggest surprise by all of this is one of the biggest surprises is the master's reaction. You would think that he would blow up. You would think that the master would have him executed, or at least have him arrested, or put him out on the street with nothing. But the master in this parable commended his shrewd solution. Now, P.W. Manson said this as well as anybody has ever said it. This explains this whole thing. There's a world of difference between saying, I applaud the dishonest steward because he acted cleverly, which is what's happening here, and I applaud the clever steward because he acted dishonestly. He's not applauding the dishonesty. He's finding something good in an ugly situation. And sometimes you and I are so black and white in our thinking that makes this hard to understand, doesn't it? Sometimes we're so black and white in our thinking, we think this is a bad guy. There's nothing good about him. Well, he was able to find something good. He was shrewd, and he was clever, and he was resourceful. And even though it was a sinful solution, you have to admit it was pretty brilliant. And so the fellow has something going for him. And so the master's reaction was due to, apparently, to the steward's resourcefulness. And he commended him rather than, I'm sure he still fired him and probably still put him out. But he had, I'd have to give it to you. You are shrewd and you did think on your feet. And then Jesus uses this as a lesson when he said, the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. And so what do we learn from this? What does Jesus want us to take away from the parable of the dishonest steward? What do we as Christians? He doesn't want us to be dishonest. He doesn't want us to embezzle from our employers. He doesn't want us to go out and say good things about all of the crooked things going on in the world. But the fact is, we think in such black and white terms that we forget there's something good to be said about everybody just about. I've told you this story before because it sticks with me. When I was a young preacher, I interviewed a young man. I was trying to help him. His father was in jail for robbing a bank, and I was counseling him, trying to help this young man. And I said, tell me a good thing about your father. I've heard negative things about him. Tell me a good thing about him. He said, well, he bought me nice things with the money he stole. And so, there's something good to be found in about anything. And so Jesus finds something good, and he finds a good lesson in this parable here. The first lesson is a lesson about diligence. The Bible tells us to be diligent. Study, be diligent to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed. Diligence means to apply yourself, to use yourself. The point of this parable seems to be the children of this world, whose hopes are centered on material things, have more energy in that realm than Christians have in the practice of Christianity. Did you get that? That's the point here. The point here is this fellow used more resourcefulness and more energy toward these material accomplishments than you and I do toward eternal accomplishments. And a good illustration of that is sports. You take a man that loves a particular sport. I'm not going to pick on any particular one. I know golf fanatics. I know basketball fanatics. I know baseball fanatics. I know all those guys. But you love a particular sport, and you learn the game, and you learn all the players' names. That takes time and energy. You learn their statistics. You buy tickets. You make time to go see them play. Sacrifice sleep for late games, and all of those things. And the question is, and this may not apply to anybody in this room. I don't know. But the question is, do you apply that much energy and that much sacrifice and that much learning to your service for God, to your Christianity, to your work with the church? That's what he's trying to say here. He's saying this fellow put his shoulder to the wheel in a dishonest pursuit with such fervor and such energy, more so than what we use in serving God. That's the point here. And so certainly we can learn from that. If Christians were as persistent about the pursuit of souls as the fan is about his or her team, you know the word fan comes from the word fanatic, right? That's where it came from. And so if the fan is so fervent and zealous about his team, if the Christian were that way about lost souls, well, we'd have to be knocking out walls. We would have to be bringing in new benches and new places to put people. So Jesus is saying, look at the way worldly men pursue their ambitions. If they're so eager about uncertain riches of this world, why aren't you more enthusiastic about real values? That's what he's saying. And what a lesson for us. The children of this world are more diligent than the children of light. There's another lesson here about preparing for the future. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10. We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in this body according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. We all know that's going to happen. Realistically, Christians know that a time to give an account of our lives is coming. This fellow, when he embezzled from his master, he had to know in the back of his mind, somebody's going to see these books one of these days. Somebody's going to sit down and figure up all of this one of these days, and it's not going to add up. And somebody's going to go to the master and tell them, I know I'm going to get caught one of these days. Yet he did it anyway. And he didn't really apply himself. Well, Jesus says Christians know that there's a time to give an account of our lives, and yet some of us appear to view this day in an unrealistic fashion, as if it's not going to happen, as if we're going to fall through the cracks. He sized some of us, the shrewd manager in Jesus' story, he was realistic. He was realistic once he got caught, wasn't he? He had to size up the situation in a flash. He saw it was a hopeless situation, and some of us don't seem to be quite that smart. We get into a mess and we keep digging the hole deeper. You will never get out of a hole by digging. You never will. You'll just keep getting deeper and deeper. You got to stop, put that shovel down, figure out how you got here, and figure out how to get out. And I've had to do it more than once, and others have had to do it. And so this fella, he knows that he's in a mess, and he has to stop and figure this out. Sometimes we, rather than do that, we deny. We deny that we're guilty. We make excuses. Well, it was this or it was that, or we shift the blame to somebody else. And that sort of thinking is just not realistic. Each of us has to assume the responsibility for our own situation and our own decisions and what our choices have created. I've said this many times. I believe it with all my heart. I've proved it in my own life, and have made plenty of mistakes before I learned this lesson, and that is life is more about choice than chance. Where you are has a whole lot to do with choices you've made. And where you're going to be has to do with choices you made. Nobody made this man steal from his master. He chose to do it, and it caused him now at an older age to end up out on the street. And he's having to figure out what to do about it. And so one who truly believes in a final judgment looks at the long-range issues of life and thinks clearly about what's important and would act decisively. And then there's another lesson here about management of resources. You remember reading Matthew 25 and verse 31 and following. Jesus said one of the things we're going to be judged on in the last great day is how well or how poorly we used our resources when it comes to benevolence. When it comes to those, when Jesus refers to those of his household, he's talking about Christians and those who have need. You remember in that scenario in Matthew 25 and verse 31 and following is the judgment day, and the judge, the master, puts the goats on the left hand, the sheep on the right, and the sheep get to go into eternal life, and the goats into eternal punishment. Verse 46 says that very plainly. And they start asking why. Why are we given these sentences? And he says, because when I was cold, you didn't help me. When I was in prison, when I was naked, when I was hungry, when I needed water, you didn't help. And they're going to say, well, we never saw you like that. And he said, yeah, you did. You saw my children that way. You saw these little ones, these of mine, and you didn't help. And then on the other hand, those who get to go, those who are on the right hand, did those things, and they too asked, when did we do these things? And he said, when you did it to the least of these little ones of mine. That's when you do it. And so we are to obviously manage our resources so that we can do good for the church. We can do good for others. Hungry people have been fed. Orphans and widows have been provided homes for, and souls have heard the gospel because Christians use their resources properly. And certainly we want you to continue to do that. Our faith is sometimes like that described by James, though, sadly speaking, in James 2 and verse 15. If a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you say to them, depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled, notwithstanding you give not those things which are needful to the body, what does it profit? What does it profit? And you may say, well, I didn't get that, preacher. Well, here's the picture. Somebody comes to you in desperate need, and you have opportunity. Galatians 6 and verse 10, as you therefore have opportunity, you have the money, you have the opportunity to help, and you say, well, go your way, and I hope everything works out for you, and you don't help. You don't help. Or the proverbial answer for Christians oftentimes is, go your way, and I'll pray for you. I'll pray for you. No, I have the means to help him. I'm supposed to help him. And we're not talking about people that are lazy and people that play the system and people that won't work, could work and wouldn't work. We talk about people that need help and people that can't get themselves, or trying and can't get the ends to tie, or can't get themselves out of this situation. There also could be a lesson here on money management, not just management of resources, but just dollars and cents money management. Yesterday at the marriage seminar, we had a good lesson on money management, and it was very basic and very simple. And the guy said, the speaker said, write down everything that you make and everything that you owe, and if you or that you spend each month, and if you spend more each month than what you make each month, you need to change that. And that's very basic. That's very simple, isn't it? You don't spend more than you make, you're going to be in trouble. And so there may be a lesson here on that as well. There's also a lesson here that we don't own anything. It all belongs to the master. In this worker's case, it belonged to his master, but Jesus is the one giving the parable, and God owns it all. We are stewards of God's possessions. And we will, as you remember the definition of a steward, somebody's been entrusted with the goods of another to use them wisely and well until the owner comes back for them. He'll be back. He'll be back for them one of these days. Called into account about how well or how poorly we use these things. Another thing that we learn here is there is a difference. There is a difference, family. There is a difference between right and wrong. Ethical behavior is expected of God's people. I don't expect people out in the world to behave ethically because they have very few ethics. And they're not bound by the same code that you and I are. But among God's people, ethical behavior is absolutely always you and I are. But among God's people, ethical behavior is absolutely always a must. Do the right thing. There is a difference between right and wrong. We are to use our time on earth to prepare for eternity. Is another lesson here. Because the time will come when we'll be called into account. The time will come when somebody will tell the master, his time's up. You need to see how he gains. Jesus said it so many times. Jesus talked about it's more important to lay up treasures in heaven. That's what he talks about here. It's more important to do the good things and lay up treasures in heaven as opposed to spending all of your time on earthly gain. And then, of course, we want to pray the prayer. Always pray this prayer. God, help us to be more diligent about our service to God than we are in worldly pursuits. I know you have to work. God knows it. I know you have to put in 40 or 50 hours a week. God understands that. Everybody understands that this life is, ever since the sin in the garden in Genesis 3, man has had to make a living by the sweat of his face, and he has to fight briars and thistles and difficulties and all of those kinds. Everybody understands that. God understands that. But there is never an excuse for applying more diligence to worldly pursuits than we do to heavenly pursuits. It's interesting to me that we spend most of our time, most of our energy, oftentimes, maybe that's an unfair blanket statement, but oftentimes people spend more time on temporary things and neglect the eternal things. Well, the eternal things are what are going to matter in the last great day. Yes, you have to enjoy this life. Yes, you have to live. Yes, you have to make money and to help people. All those things are understood, but not to the detriment of your eternal preparation. I believe that's what Jesus is teaching with this difficult parable, that we are to put as much energy and time into our spiritual pursuits as the world does in their worldly pursuits. We are to pursue those things with a zeal and a fervor that surpasses what the world does in their sinful pursuits. If that makes sense to you, and you want to get started on this road to heaven, you want to start using things the way they're supposed to be used, you want to start living this life the way it's supposed to be lived, in light of the fact that it's a temporary life, let us help you with that. If you'll but come now as we stand and sing.